It's my great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, who is Agnes Brokerhof. She works as a senior scientist at the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands in Amsterdam. Her interests are in preventive conservation, risk management, and value management for collections. She contributed to including cultural heritage in the Dutch flood risk management plan, which every European country is required to have by the European Flood Directive. For this, she developed a quick flood risk scan method to determine the vulnerable value of monuments for flood risk assessment. The assessment method enables differentiation of cultural heritage by cultural value and vulnerability to water from rainfall or flooding. With this method, hazard or exposure maps can be turned into risk maps showing the potential loss of cultural value in case of flooding with a particular probability. The quick flood risk scan method has been tested and validated in the city of Dordrecht, the Netherlands. This application was facilitated by an open lab of the Shelter project. Agnes will present the work that she published together with colleagues Renate van Leyen and Barry Gersonius. And Agnes' talk is today entitled Protecting Built Heritage Against Flood, Mapping Vulnerability and Value Density as Flood hazard maps, on flood hazard maps. Welcome, Agnes, and over to you.
I'm going to share with you the work that I did with these two happy faces, Renate and Barry. And we were looking for a simple and quick method to scan the flood risks for built heritage in the Netherlands in order to set priorities for both policy making and protection. And why is this bar still not moving out? Something Zoom and I don't agree on. It went just a minute ago. It'll go. The story is set in the Netherlands. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Netherlands, we're the second after the US, according to a video a number of years ago. Netherlands is situated at the northwestern side of the European continent. And as the name indicates, it is nether, it is the lowlands, it is the delta of a number of big rivers flowing from the Alps and other mountains in Europe down to the sea. And you could say the Netherlands is the drain of Europe. And as drains do, they regularly overflow. So flood management is a thing for the Netherlands, but we can't do that on our own because most of the water comes from outside of our country. So it's a European thing. And flood management in Europe requires indeed each member state to come up with flood risk management plans. And they have come up with this directive. Every member state has to make a plan. And the aim of the flood directive is to reduce risk and damage to human health in terms of deathly casualties, worst case, also to economic activity, vital infrastructure, to the environment and the landscape, and to cultural heritage. And this is, I find, quite special that cultural heritage is indeed part of the directive and the flood plans. And the EU obliges member states to establish flood maps that display the important objects. And if we do that for cultural heritage, in this case, the monuments, national monuments, in the Netherlands, this is built heritage and archaeological sites. Then we have 64,000 dots on the map, rather small country. So it's quite full. You wonder what the rest of the country does. But what do you do with 64,000 dots on the map? There's no way you can prioritize this. So we were feeling somehow we have to differentiate between what is more important and what is less important. But you can't just say, okay, we'll give them different values and we protect the highest value because it's all national monuments. And once you're above that threshold, you're all the same. Still, we felt that's not the way to go. We can overlap the object map, the monuments map, with flood maps and then flood hazard maps. And then we see what is going to get wet and what not. In this case, this shows the maximum water depth in meters for a flood from sea, rivers, or lakes, with an extremely small chance of once in every 100,000 years. But you see, we're a flat country. We don't have mountains. So when the water rises up to 5 meters, that means that's quite something. Which of these dots do we have to protect specially and which not? Well, that brings us to risk assessment. And there are many sort of brilliant brains that have published papers on how to do flood risk assessments all over the world. And they all look at large data sets, come up with formulas, difficult mathematics, and it's a bit scary. And we felt we need a slightly different way to do the same work, but get at it in a quicker way. So we went to a quick scan, or a quick risk scan, a QUISC scan, the QUISC flood scan in this case. This makes use of your usual ingredients for risk assessment. Risk is a chance of losing value, where the chance deals with the probability, and the losing value is the impact. Probability is related to the exposure, the probability of something getting wet, and the impact is a combination of susceptibility and of value. And those are the ingredients that we used for the QUISC scan that Anna Bülow and myself published a number of years ago. We say, okay, you've got to have value. If you have no value, you can't lose any value. But the value needs to be vulnerable or susceptible, because if it's not, you don't have to worry. And then once you have vulnerable value, it needs to be exposed, because if it doesn't get wet in this case, we also don't worry about it. So if you have those three components, you have an asset that may lose value, that is at risk. And that is the same principle as looking at maps, overlapping maps, where you can map your assets, the valuable, the important ones, where you then overlap it with which ones are actually vulnerable, which ones will actually get exposed to water, and then you end up with the assets at risk. It's a well-known methodology, and I love it for its visuality and its simplicity. So the exposure maps we have, but we had to come up with something that deals with the susceptibility. So I organized a work session with our built heritage experts at our Cultural Heritage Agency, and I asked them to assess the susceptibility to water and flood for a range of buildings that I showed them pictures of, and said, can you please order them in low, medium, high susceptibility? And they actually agreed quite easily that it has to do with the material and the construction. So low susceptible are buildings that are made from stone, good brickwork, concrete, reinforced concrete, with a strong structure, construction, and relatively basic decoration. So if you look at a bridge like this, built to sustain water, or a sturdy building, you get the feeling this is robust, this is a low susceptibility. In the medium category, they came up with buildings that would either be in not the best condition, or just simply less strong building material, lesser quality brickworks and stonework, lesser construction, and maybe more decoration. And in the high vulnerability category came buildings made of wood with plaster, fancy stonework, not a strong construction, and high the decorated parts. So a windmill made out of brick is less susceptible than a wooden windmill. And a lovely plastered interior obviously falls in the category of high susceptibility. Now, there's some more details to it, but this is sort of to give you this rough impression. And we did the same for value. And I said all creatures above of international listing are of value, and we don't differentiate. So we have to look at something else. It has to do with the footprint, with the size, with the number of floors. It actually has to do with the amount of value in a certain square meter, for example. So it's more like a value density. And if we look at the value density, we also looked at this with our architectural history people who usually do the listings in the Netherlands. And they said, well, there's these structures that aren't actually made for living. They're not buildings in the sense that they're houses or they're no longer used as such. But we have listed border markers, bridges, electricity, switch houses. Okay. They fall in the category of a low value density. Then we have either buildings that are listed because of their architectural importance, but the interior is completely modernized, adapted to something else, not important anymore. Or vice versa, we have buildings that are not listed, but the interior, such as a museum collection, is of value. So they're in the medium category. And then in the high category, we have the combination of both. If we have a listed building with a collection inside, take the National Museum or a historic house with a lovely interior, then that is high value density. And if we combine those two, we get this matrix, which we can give traffic light colors. And then all of a sudden, you can imagine that you can color the map, all these 64,000 dots on the map, and you get a differentiation in where we may lose a lot of value or less value because it's vulnerable value. So we thought, let's do a trial. And we did this in the city of Dordrecht. It's a very picturesque old city situated just south of Rotterdam, the big harbor of the Netherlands. And it's at the so-called Three River Point, as you see, three rivers flowing around the city, you can almost say, where the inner city is over here and you have the harbor. And it has a history of regular flooding, no surprise. And Dordrecht was a case study in a European shelter project with other countries looking at flood risk. So this was a win-win situation that we could do the case study there. Dordrecht is full of listed buildings, both nationally listed and locally listed. So you think here we have a differentiation in value. No, we don't. It's just a matter of who pays for the upkeeping. So that wasn't a good one to differentiate in value. So we had to go further. And as far as the chance of flooding is concerned, you see the people are used to it. They just look outside until the water has sunk again. On this map, you can see that all the parts along the water are regularly flooded once every 10 years. And nowadays, that's even more often. And the whole inner city, much less so. That's only once every 10, 100,000 years. Is well protected. It's well protected because it is all diked in. It's protected by dikes. And as long as the dikes hold, there's no problem at all. But if the dikes break, it goes up to 5 meters down there. So that's not what you want. So the city actually invests heavily in protecting its inner city from the water. But the outer dike regions, they have to deal with the floods. So we selected 19 random buildings, and we thought we need a method that is foolproof, that non-professionals can do. So we had 2 eager students and sent them out on the street just looking from the street at the buildings and say, how do you assess the value, density, and their vulnerability based on this matrix that we give you? And they came back with a coloring on the maps, which we then asked our colleagues and the experts from the city council. And they couldn't come up with any better arguments, so we decided this is it. And what did they find? That there were, out of the 19, 3 highly vulnerable buildings, because they had an interior and a listed building, such as the City Museum, but also 2 nice historic houses. Fortunately, they're all behind the dikes. They're protected, so we have no exposure and temporarily, for the time being at least, no risk. We also had medium vulnerable value buildings, historic houses mostly, with not the most interesting interiors, but still enough to care about. And they were actually outside the dikes, so they can flood at higher or lower levels. So they will need some protection. And then we had, here's an example of a low vulnerable value building. It's just recently restored. It's very good quality masonry. It is in an area that will get flooded regularly, but it can withstand it. So altogether, we were quite pleased about this, that we had developed a method that non-expert assessors can prioritize without calculations a loss of value. And talking about loss of value rather than value makes it much easier to communicate, because it's much easier to say to someone, you actually have a building that can lose value rather than you have a valuable building that can get wet. Also, if you then talk to your neighbor, you can say, my building's more value than yours. That makes it a bit nasty. But if you say, I can actually lose a lot of value because I have high value or because I have a high vulnerability, it makes it easier to discuss with each other. This is only one of those quick methods, and you can follow it up with a more detailed assessment. And as Rob was saying yesterday, you don't want to go into more detail just because of the detail. You need something that works. And once you need more detail, you go deeper. So you want something that works. And we find this helps very well in the first differentiation. Question is, who does the assessment? Is this something that you do top down and policymakers tell the inhabitants of Dordrecht, in this case, what to do? Or do you do it bottom up? You ask the owners of the building to assess their own risk and tell and then say what they need to protect themselves. Because in the Netherlands, many of the monuments, the listed buildings, are privately owned. So the city keeps the streets dry, but the owners need to keep their house dry. So there's still thinking of how to apply this methodology, what to do with it. What we learned from the exercise is that most of the cultural heritage actually benefits from protection of people and economy. It's the dikes that protect the lot. But those monuments that are outside the diked areas, we can highlight them because of the hazard map, and we can indicate where is the biggest loss of value to be expected, and we can help them. We can help them with advice and information, awareness, tools of how to assess your own risk, decide what to do, maybe even some financial support. And in case of the city of Dordrecht, you can see here, when the flood warnings come, the city provides the owners with sandbags. They can bag up their houses and keep the water out, or even at street level, there's the barriers installed. As I said, the city keeps the streets dry and the owners get the sandbags to keep their houses dry. So Dordrecht is quite well advanced in this whole flood management as they do it. And I hope they can also be an example for other cities on how to deal with their flood risks. And we hope that with our methodology, sort of the quiz scan, we can add something into dividing the high risks from the lower risks and help spend money appropriately. So if you want to read more of it in more detail, it's an open access publication. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope it inspires you in your own work and dealing with your own risks.
Thank you very much, Agnes. And we're a bit ahead of time. So I just wondered, because I know there's been lots of feedback on your talk. So there will be questions, which is always great. So I do wonder if
we make it a dialogue after all.
Oh, exactly. But I think with being ahead of our time, I invite our next speaker, Dr. Emma Cunliffe, because then I think we might have more time at the end of her talk, really, for both of you. And maybe we can then, as you say, we do get that dialogue. I think that would be wonderful.
Oh, excellent.
So, I would then invite Dr. Emma Cunliffe. Welcome, Dr. Emma Cunliffe. Dr. Emma Cunliffe is part of the Secretariat for the Blue Shield and is a Senior Research Associate in the UNESCO Chair Cultural Property Protection, CPP, and Peace Team at Newcastle University, a Fellow of the Newcastle University Policy Academy, and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. She teaches CPP and its intersections with human security and national humanitarian law, provides CPP subject matter expertise on military exercises for national and multinational forces, and is the National Committee Coordinator for Blue Shield worldwide. She chairs the Conflict and Military Activity Working Group for Blue Shield UK National Committee, and her presentation is entitled The Blue Shield, Heritage Protection in Crisis. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much. That's very kind. Can you hear me and see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk primarily about Blue Shield at the international level, but as I'll show you, we have a lot of national committees, and I just want to give you a highlight about some of their work as well. So the Blue Shield, we are an independent, impartial, neutral NGO established in 1996, and we protect heritage in conflict and disaster. We have an international board and secretariat, which is Blue Shield International, and I'm in that secretariat. So we're named after a piece of international law that was written after World War II, designed to protect cultural property in conflict. And that is the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. And that has an emblem, the blue and white shield, and that's what gives us our name, like the way the International Committee of the Red Cross is named after the Red Cross emblem, or both. And in the 1999 Second Protocol to the Hague Convention, we're named as an expert advisory body in matters of cultural protection and armed conflicts. So our mission today is going a little bit further than that sort of 1954 conflict focus of cultural property. The Blue Shield is committed to the protection of cultural property, but also cultural and natural heritage and intangible heritage as well. And we work across armed conflicts and disasters. And today, I think we're best envisaged as the organisation that works to bring together the heritage sector, the humanitarian sector, and the uniform sector, by which I mean soldiers, police, borders and customs, and emergency response. So today we have 33 committees fully registered around the world, 5 more under construction, and quite a few more considering construction. So we're pretty hopeful that we might have 40 by the end of next year, and we're growing all the time. And I think the key thing for us is that we're formed from and we work with the major international heritage organizations. So the ICA, which is the International Council on Archives, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. I don't know why my slides keep moving. Thought I cleared that. The International Council of Museums and the International Council of Monuments and Sites. So we work across the whole heritage sector and with heritage professionals worldwide, so that when there's a crisis, people know who to go to for the heritage sector to be represented with one voice. So you're not trying to find representatives from all these different areas to work out what needs doing, and so that we can advocate for them and make sure that no sector is excluded. Now, like I said, though, our roots are in the Hague Convention, and that has a really specific definition of protection. And that definition does actually inform a lot of our work, because its measures are also good in disasters as well as conflict. So the Hague Convention tells us that cultural protection comprises safeguarding, which means prepare in peace. It's pretty simple. Just put measures in place in peacetime for the foreseeable impacts that you might have to deal with. And whilst the convention talks about conflict, that is a sensible measure for disasters as well. And then it has the measures of respect, which are the conflict military measures. And these inform a lot of our work. So Blue Shield works across 6 areas of activity. And the first one of those is coordination, both obviously amongst ourselves. I'm the National Committee Coordinator, and I have the privilege, I think, of working with our committees around the world. But we also work with partner organisations. So here you can see us signing a letter of intent with the UNESCO Culture and Emergencies section. You can see us signing an MOU with UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. And we also have an MOU with the Red Cross, the ICRC. So we work really as strongly as we can to bring these 3 sectors together and really try and have a comprehensive view of heritage protection. We do a lot of capacity building and education and training. In the picture here, you can see ICOM Georgia and Georgian Blue Shield, who have been running safeguarding training in Georgia for many years now. But as another example, we do a lot of defense work. So, for example, in these pictures, the bottom right is our support to a Special to Arms Cultural Property Protection course. And although it says pilot, that course has now been running since 2019. But Dr. Fox, who was then part of UK Blue Shield and part of the Secretariat with me in 2019, he was the course director. We run an annual training, like a week-long course with the UN Peacekeeping School in Ireland. The participants rated the course excellent, an amazing experience. This course opened up my eyes to the important work of Blue Shield. It's an organisation all nations should use. And that is really how we're there. We like to come in to be helpful. Our training isn't just standing in a classroom and saying to you, well, this is what the law says your responsibilities are. But we really like to, as you can see, to take people out there to deal with cultural heritage and how you actually need to protect it. What might that involve in practice? And why is it so difficult? So actually in the middle there, you can see myself portraying a refugee. So the soldiers get there, they're expecting to just do some surveys of damaged cultural property, go home. But of course, the world doesn't work that way. There are people there with lives that have been devastated by the conflict, and they have to be able to deal with that as well. You can't separate people from their heritage. I think it's fairly well known that we work with NATO quite closely. We've been doing that since 2011. We also have a formal letter of intent with them, and we've got a multi-year action plan. And so today we do a lot of crisis response exercises, warfighting exercises, but also seminars, workshops. What does the future look like for cultural protection, and how can we keep doing it better? We work obviously in legal compliance and policy, but most importantly, not just advocating for all countries to sign the 1954 Hague Convention, but actually to say, well, you know, what does this look like in practice? It's all very well to say the law says conduct safeguarding, but what does that mean? And here we partner particularly closely with Newcastle University. So you'll see their logo at the bottom. We're part of the UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace. And that's why we really want to research what the law looks like in practice. So you've got a book I edited there with Paul Fox. And we do a lot of research to find out what good practice could look like and what the weaknesses are that we want people to overcome. And there's a lot of advocacy and lobbying for that to try and really improve standards, work with governments to provide advice. Safeguarding is all about the protective measures people put in place in peace. I'm obviously never going to stand here and say that all heritage could be saved if people put measures in place in peacetime. But the reality is that heritage protection would be far more successful if more measures were put in place in peacetime. Now, we do a lot of our work in conflict and disaster as well. Obviously, you can see a Blue Shield France training for disaster response here. And in fact, Blue Shield France have now gone on to get accreditation from their government as a civil responder. So the French system means you've got to be authorized by the government to respond in a crisis. And they are now a legally registered responder for heritage and emergencies, which is it's a fantastic achievement. A lot of my own work in this area, though, involves trying to explain why heritage and conflict measures is not the same as heritage disaster measures. And just to sort of give you some examples here, you are, if you find you like the sound of my voice, there are many of my talks available online. We do a lot of lectures on this, but we also help develop tools. So, for example, ICOM Austria with Blue Shield Austria and my support developed a tag about marking objects in museum collections that should be evacuated as an emergency. And that's the same whether it's in a disaster or in a conflict. What is it you need to get to safety first? Now, we did some training in Blue Shield in Georgia, and this was a 3-year project organized by Blue Shield Georgia that we sort of supported part of. Gori is an area of Georgia on the eastern side. And I think this quote really sums it up. Everything we have learned over the last 2 years of our safeguarding project came together in this latest training. We're very thankful to Blue Shield Georgia. I've worked in the Gori Museum for 20 years, and despite the risk, we've never before explored these issues. We're very lucky this training was done in our museum. As much as I hope to never use this information, I feel so lucky that we have it. Now, that training that they've never had is in emergency evacuation in a crisis, in how to document your collection quickly, how to evacuate it quickly, and where to take it to, but with an added level of security threat and analysis. So it's not just about an earthquake, but what do you do if the tanks are also rolling over the horizon? And I mean, that is the ICOM emergency evacuation process, which, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think it's really important to recognize existing good practice. But for us, it was about those conflict measures. And you can see here the training was with the National Guard as well. It had heritage professionals from the whole region, as well as a number of government officials, so they could understand their role in crisis response. Because one of the big things for us was to also highlight the fact that, for example, disaster planning assumes that your staff are mostly there, and if they're not there immediately, they will hopefully be able to respond in the days or weeks that follow a crisis. It assumes that at some point the emergency services are going to respond. If you have a fire, you assume that the fire agency will come. But the reality in conflict is that your emergency services might be operating at 1/3 capacity. Your staff may have caring responsibilities, they may have left, they may be refugees, displaced, or, you know, God forbid, they may have died. Your resources and your options will be very, very limited. And the preparations you need to put in place to manage the situations are very, very different in those cases. And ultimately, the fact that it could be a very long-term situation. The average length of a conflict is about 10 years, whereas a disaster, whilst you will deal with the aftermath for some time, the situation itself is not ongoing. So in that, I do quite a lot of workshops. I like testing new ideas, and this is where sort of my research role and my professional practice role come together. And the types of workshops we've looked at have looked at, for example, landscapes, That's huge in Africa. How do you protect a sacred landscape, and what might that involve? What does cultural heritage risk look like in a military assessment? How can we improve exercise support for armed forces, and all sorts of ideas like that? So this is just one example. This is one of the first ones we did actually in 2018. And this was a conference run by the German Bundeswehr called Coping with Culture. And in this, we create a fictional country called Danubia. And those of you who are very sharp-eyed might notice that it looks a lot like Vienna, with the old town of Vienna is that red border in the middle. But we're pretending it's Danubia. There's a growing conflict, and our soldiers, we're pretending, but they are a mix in reality of real soldiers, but also heritage professionals learning how to work together. And so each of those go into syndicate groups where they're pretending to be a staff officer in a brigade deployed into this area to help keep the peace and prevent an escalation in the war. Now, this fictional staff officer is responsible for cultural property protection. And we send them out to the Military Museum, which is the blue flag on the map, to assess the risk to the museum, but also the risk that that museum poses to the mission, because it's not actually a soldier's job necessarily to protect cultural property. The soldier's job is to achieve the mission, and the heritage professional's job is to put measures in place to protect cultural property. Soldiers do have legal obligations, of course, about mitigating the impact of missions on cultural property, but they're not there to, for example, stand guard around it. They're not a police force. They aren't trained in judiciary proceedings or rights of arrest or any of the framework of your police. So they had to work out what they needed to do. How important in our fictional scenario is this museum, and what impacts could it have? And I could talk about that a lot more, but the thing that I kind of want to highlight that came out of it is that there are different types of value that we as heritage professionals need to get better at dealing with in conflicts. So the first and most obvious one, obviously, there's historical value. What is the most culturally or historically important thing in the museum? And it's this balloon. It's a hot air balloon. It's from the start of the Napoleonic Wars. It's the only one of its kind. And it is from the start of it's the beginning of aerial warfare, which is kind of amazing. And I have to say, I didn't even notice it the first time. But then we have cultural value, and this is one we need to get a lot better at assessing. So in our fictional scenario, we have different societies with increasing social tension. Museum curator, if you have a situation of social tension, do you have anything that is of particular significance to particular communities? And he said, well, actually, in reality, I have these two banners, and there's not even a good photo of them. They're not really considered in the tours or in the photos people take. But those two banners at the back of this picture are photos taken by our banners from the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the defeat of Vienna, where it was defeated at Vienna. And that's why they're in the museum in Vienna. And people from Turkey still come to pray under those banners today. So they're very, really significant to them. But actually, you could imagine if that was, a fictional situation and you had tensions between different groups, actually you need to think about what have these deep community attachments that could be a source of tension or risk within a museum. But then, of course, well, it's a military museum. It's full of military equipment. And there were a lot of discussions then realizing this equipment is live. The museum is owned by the Ministry of Defense, not the Ministry of Culture. And so actually, then your risk perspective for your mission suddenly changes a lot as well, because this is, this could have a real impact on your mission. It's effectively unsecured equipment. The security here is far lower than the security at a military base. I mean, still security, obviously, but. And so it's these different perceptions of value, I think, that are really intrinsic to how we understand and frame our role as heritage professionals. Because what becomes important to people in a conflict can be quite different to what's important to them in peace. We do a lot of emergency response, of course. You can see here a fire in a church in the Old Town in Peru, and our Peruvian National Committee was integral in the response to that. We were on the ground within hours supporting Blue Shield Lebanon and their partners, Baladi. And Baladi in particular went on to lead a lot of the rescue work in Beirut. We've been out in the field as Blue Shield International into conflict-affected areas in Syria and in Turkey after the earthquake with the Turkish National Committee. And like I said, our national committees are very active in disaster response. And you can see here just emergency response to sort of fire in a building, to wildfires, to a building collapse in Köln, and there's another archive fire there in Senegal. And we do a lot of stabilization, disaster work, and long-term ongoing support work. So in this, I sort of loosely categorized our work countering trafficking. We have a working group there that deals with trying to support borders and customs, provide advice to police in different investigations, and assist in repatriations. We support the OSCE Heritage Crime Task Force training. And those are just sort of a couple of examples of our work tackling illicit trafficking, but also the crime that results from it. Because I think there's not enough understanding that looting is a crime, and you need special forensic techniques to deal with that. Some of our biggest work lately has been field missions, for example, out in Ukraine, where for us it's been less about visiting damaged buildings, although we've done that as well, but more about viewing the affected cultural heritage and then looking at the community response nearing the front lines and seeking to understand the practical implementation of IHL. So developing forensic data collection methods with our Ukrainian partners, analytical capability within civil military forces, and meeting with people like the National Security Advisor or the Territorial Defence Forces. For us, it's been about the security implications of cultural property protection and how to best uphold international humanitarian law in those circumstances. So what does our future look like? Well, obviously, ongoing work influencing politicians, international agencies, the military, even non-state armed groups. We want to continue to support our national committees and build that resource and capacity around the world. I would love it if every state party that had signed the Hague Convention had a national committee. There are 136, I'm going to say, state parties to the Hague Convention. So even moving up to 40 national committees is a third of the world, and that would be huge. But I don't want it to stop at that 135 or 6. I would love it if all countries ratified the Hague Convention, but then implemented it. Most of them haven't really done much yet in that area. And there's very few safeguarding measures and very little military training. We want to work more strongly with our uniformed service partners. I think that's really important to really encourage co-training with fire, with rescue, and with the armed forces. When we were set up, somebody suggested that we were the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. Is that our goal? Absolutely. Is it going to happen in my lifetime? I don't know, but it would be great if it could. But that is where we're aiming to be. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions, and please do feel free to check us out on our website.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emma. Lots of food for thought, I'm pretty sure. And also, I think it's been really interesting. Yesterday, there was a lot about exactly these sort of areas and what training is there available, who to go to. Yesterday, the theme really was very much about, I think, the people, the communities affected. So this is really great. And Agnes, if you're there, could I ask you to switch on your camera for our Q&A? Thank you very much. So, as I said, thank you very much. We got a lot of questions for both of you. And with Slido, they have also been kind of upvoted. So I will start, Agnes, if I can start with you, asking question number 1. Where is the vulnerability information stored? Is there a central repository that all participating museums can access and the public can access or others can access? That's a question to you.
Yeah, no, it's a good suggestion. There's not such a repository. And maybe that's also not the aim of this methodology. It's much more providing you with some of the arguments that will allow you to assess your vulnerability. And as said, we've tried to keep those choices as simple as possible. Because, of course, other factors come into play. You have your material, you have your construction, but then you also have your age. Has something proven to withstand the time, then it's actually more robust than you might think, or it is in a bad condition and it's actually less robust than you would expect from the material and the construction. So there's also a bit of feeling for that. But I think the methodology is not so much aimed to give you the right answer, but to provide you with ways to think about it, and for building owners, for example, assess your own vulnerability and discuss it with others and compare. And then, of course, our own experts have their own way of doing it, and they can also be used as a soundboard.
So it would still need some kind of looking at it, but still tailoring to the situation. I think oftentimes, and again, I think that's where the training really is quite interesting. Emma, the question number one for you: can institutions book trainings? Are they given in English or other languages as well?
Yes, you are welcome to book us for training. Do feel free to get in touch. We have only primarily done our training in English, but if somebody also wanted to hire an interpreter, I'd be very happy to work with them as well. I'll be honest and say that I have now failed 3 different languages. So I'm afraid it would need an interpreter, but that shouldn't be a barrier.
And that's very interesting. That's what we found in ICOM-CC. I think sometimes, again, we don't think about the significance of language. So sometimes just translating is a big step towards providing access to these opportunities. Agnes, question number 2. What specialists were on the team who determined the parameters for susceptibility?
They were our built heritage physical experts, so they're more like the engineers, building physics people. We have a bunch of those that advise on restoration of monuments and assess demands for subsidies. And the other half of the group were the historians, architectural historians, that look at the arguments for listing, which is much more of an artsy-fartsy background. So those two together sort of constructed the matrix in their way of thinking. All I do is let people think and then try to analyze it and squeeze it into a matrix, and it worked.
That's great collaboration.
Absolutely.
Emma, question 2, and again, this is something that came up yesterday as well. Is there any mental health training provided for the students in the training programs, particularly for dealing with people, dealing with the aftermath of disasters, and or challenging or triggering collections that need salvaging?
Unfortunately not, and I'm aware it's a gap. With my research hat on, there's some research we're looking at doing in some conflict zones at the moment with all the ethical approvals, but there is a lot of support available through the university that deals with that kind of thing for the researchers. And it is my hope that we can take some lessons away from that we could make more generally available. But I don't know if that's going to be possible. But I do agree that that is a need. There was something created a few years ago by Heritage for Peace, pulling together some guidance, but I remember proofreading it in about 2013, but I don't know what happened to it.
Yeah, it's but again, that's something that came up yesterday. I think a lot about where I think we might not necessarily think about that, but obviously that's a very important aspect, and so hopefully it will happen. Agnes, question number 3 for you: would your plan against flood from rivers and the sea also work for heavy rains?
Yes and no. Some of the physical measures that we take, the barriers avoiding water to come into your building, are the same, but it's the preparation. In case of flood, we usually get the warning when there's high water in Germany. We know it's coming our way, and we have so much time to prepare for it. Whereas the heavy rains that also come more frequently and more heavily, they cause more unexpected situations. For example, that there's so much water in one particular location in a short time that the whole drainage system isn't designed for it. So that needs to be upgraded for part of the climate change adaptations. With the river floods, we have now, well, first we decided we keep the water in the river, so we raise our dikes. And we said, can't do that anymore, it's too much water. So we actually purposely flood parts of the country, so lower value parts of the country, usually nature that is designated as such. There are flood zones. We let the water go, and it'll dry up again when the water goes. And that's something that we can't do with heavy rain. So there is definitely a difference there.
Yeah.
At a higher policy level.
Yeah. Again, it just shows, I think, how far the ripples need to go for collaboration and communication because of the interdependencies. Emma, your third question: what training do the trainers receive? How long is it, and what are the requirements to be a trainer?
Blue Shields trainers at the international level are currently myself and my colleague, because we are the staff. So effectively, I suppose you're asking what the qualifications are for my job there.
I believe it's more to understand about, just about, I guess, in some ways, yes, I guess, what are the skills or what is needed? And probably within that question, could you do with more trainers? I'm sure it's a lot of work to do for two people.
I mean, for sure. I mean, at the moment, then it's easier to first of all clarify our training a little bit. So we have kind of two kinds. If you join our national committees, you get access to a sort of basic standard Blue Shield training course, which is available to all national committee members. It tells you more about what the Blue Shield is and does, but also more about international law, how to work with your armed forces and how to work with the humanitarian sector. As we have a module on conflict, and I'm currently working on the disaster and illicit trafficking modules now, which I need to finish maybe before Christmas if I'm lucky. So those are just, dubiously multilingual video translations, where I don't think the translations are amazing, but they are there. Which, anybody can access and read, and there's some further readings there for people. In terms of the training we go out and provide, what we actually tend to do is we don't have the capacity at the moment to make it specific to every single country, every single circumstance. So what we will do is we will design training scenarios instead that actually teach you what the questions are you need to ask. We'll usually workshop with whoever is requesting the training to understand as much as we can about the national circumstances. What laws have you signed? What do they actually let you do or not let you do? What chains of authority are already existing in your country? And then within those, we'll put those actually usually into a fictional scenario, because it's much easier for people to be able to talk about things that aren't real. As real as we can make them, but we have found previously in other situations where we use far too real world data, people brought too many real world perceptions in with them, and those would detract from what we were trying to achieve. Whereas you can, change the names, change the conflict, whatever you need, and still really work through those issues. So we'll spend like a day talking about your legal requirements, but then what is the sort of fictional scenario? And then we give you worksheets and lists of things to figure out and release you for a few hours, and then come back and kind of discuss it together as groups. So the goal is really to help the people that we're with work out what it is they haven't thought about and what they need to do so they can go in a way and address it. There's no point in us just sitting there and saying, right, well, do you have a disaster plan? What does that involve? Because that doesn't really help anybody. So the kinds of things you need to know. Firstly, we are independent, impartial, neutral. So you need to be able to adhere to those ethical standards. You need a basic framework of international humanitarian law. You don't need to be an expert, but you do need to understand, for example, what military necessity is and how that works, what you can expect from armed forces and what actually you probably can't. And how those concepts play out in a conflict so that you can then extrapolate back to understand what you might need to do in peace to make it more effective in conflicts. And those are the kinds of things we will also cover in the training we provide, just to help people start to work through a lot of those ideas, because it's a lot to take in.
Yes,
that sort of answers it at least.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really great. Agnes, a question for you again regarding value and loss value. Is there a difference between the kind of value in the risk assessment? For example, if a building has structural value, it will expose to less loss value compared to a building with aesthetic value. I don't know if I read that out okay, or shall I just read it out again?
Yeah.
So regarding value and loss value, is there a difference between the value in the risk assessment? So as the example given here is if a building has a structural value, is that maybe of a lesser value, that's how I understand it, to a building with an aesthetic value? And
no, you can't put it that simple. When it comes to values, it is the reason why we keep something. And that can be because of its structure. It can be because it's beautiful. It can be because we have an emotional connection. As long as you're able to argue why it is that you find this important, what it is that you value about it, then you have your value assessment. And that is what's going to be affected by a material change, in this case, getting wet or even partly being washed away. And then the question is, what does that do to my value? If I have half a building left, do I still have this emotional connection? Maybe the loss is not that big. Maybe it's enormous because the most important part is washed away. So this is developing an understanding. For that, we use the methodology of assessing museum collections, where we look on the one hand at cultural historic values. So they always relate to the past. It's history. It's an association with people, with places, with events happening. But there's also values in the here and now, as you were saying, the Turkish community attributing a lot of value to these two banners. They come and pray there. That's social societal value. They're in the here and now. They're much more emotional, joint of personal emotion. And then there's the use values. Something has a value because there is a potential for use, or it is actually used a lot, like buildings where you live in and work in, or a museum that serves a purpose as well. So we look at these different kinds of values and we describe it has a high value because blah, 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 blah. In the case of the matrix that we use for coloring the dots, we try to steer away a bit from which value are we talking about exactly. Is this value density? And Well, that seems to work quite well without going into all the details of the value assessment, which can be done at a later stage.
Well, thank you. And I think that kind of leads, again, I think nicely, Emma, what you mentioned in your talk. I think I was quite struck by, again, we mentioned it as a comment in the chat before for Agnes' talk, the opportunity for students to have that kind of real life experience, even if it might be something quite simple. But my question would be in terms of value and making these value assessments, how do you think the practical, the simulation, offering this training with it maybe simulated or through role play? I'm not quite sure how to maybe mention it, but really this human people interaction, working out practically these quite complex situations. Do you think there's quite a big value in that? And does that offer maybe another appreciation and insight into exploring these values? Because what I think, again, also what was mentioned, that especially during conflict or these emergencies and disasters, maybe values completely change too.
Not totally sure I understood the question. So
my question is the significance really of providing this practical training. I think really, so as you mentioned, not just in the classroom or like me rambling on, telling people what to do, but to really facilitating kind of real scenarios for the learning in practice and through practice.
I think it's vital, actually. I think until you're out there in a place, a museum, a palace. The last one we did was in Romania in a palace. And I think until you're out there actually in that situation, working with other people, I think you don't realize what it is you don't know. You can learn a lot of these things in a classroom, but until you're actually out there trying to put it into reality. And in that one, I think we changed some of the palace history. These tombs are associated with this fictional group. That art collection, though, that is a completely different fictional group. And then people had to really engage with those different value structures, because you could say, well, this is modern art. It's less important than that historical art collection in the basement. But then actually, if it is from a particular ethnic group who already feel marginalized, it does suddenly... we were sat there coming up with fake news headlines just to really, hammer the point home. So, well, if you dismiss this just because it's modern, this is what the likely reaction is going to be from an already marginalized group. And that's exactly what you're trying to avoid. You don't want to increase tensions. You want to be inclusive. So actually, it's just time to rethink those values and literally being able to walk around the place that we were saying, this is the tomb of this person who actually was famous in the sort of national narrative of your country and achieved these great things, which means actually some other groups don't like them. So there's a security concern there. And being able to really explore that. And actually for us, it was quite interesting as well, because it absolutely rained the day we were there. So that got people talking about security guard rotas, where are the staff, and there were things that actually I don't think they'd have even noticed if we hadn't been there in person. But I think it's incredibly valuable to be able to explore these things by going out and about.
Well, thank you. And thank you both very, very much for your time and for your generosity in sharing your experience and your wonderful work. And we have a little bit of time left, but I really thought this was very, very rich. And thank you very much again. This has been great.